Today I am joined by Meenal Tatpati, a researcher with a keen interest in forest rights, indigenous communities, and wildlife laws. Meenal elaborates upon the shortcomings of forest conservation, which aims to completely isolate wildlands from human presence, and how, in fact, the involvement of indigenous communities is actually needed for the success of conservation. We also discuss the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 and the Forest Rights Act of 2007 and their implications for conservation and indigenous communities. Meenal also talks about when voluntary resettlement of forest dwelling communities from these landscapes is an ideal option and the challenges behind such efforts. I hope you do enjoy this episode. So, welcome, Meenal, to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on today.
Thanks, Anish. It's good to be here as well.
What got you into conservation?
So I am I'm a born and bred city kid. I'm from Pune, lived here all my life, and for some reason my parents were always quite interested in the outdoors, and we had a really amazing zoo here, and we kept going there, and that kind of got me interested in wildlife. And then in college, I was kind of also, I mean, my interests were always there. Studies were going on, but I always felt that I would want to do something in wildlife eventually. And it was actually as I was getting more and more interested in wildlife that I came across a few papers and a few articles written by people about the politics of conservation. So these were people like Anil Agarwal from CSE. There were quite a few papers from Kalpavriksha by Ashish Kothari, that Mahesh Rangarajan, that kind of gave a very different sort of avenue to my thought process about how our forests are and how our protected areas are. I used to think that okay, it's just once a protected area is established, there are no people there, and it's wild and free, and animals are there. There aren't any people, and then this was kind of a shock to me that there are local communities living there side by side with some of the greatest wildlife in the world. And that sort of got me very, very interested in conservation. So I think those seeds are sown when you are a kid. But as you go deeper and deeper into it, you also realize that there are various facets to it. So yeah, that is what happened.
I think it also helps that Pune has got wolves and hyenas just on the outskirts.
Yeah, so there were a lot of, as a child, we would do a lot of trekking. Trekking is a very, very common thing across Pune. People just go to the forts, and there's a lot of beautiful places. Growing up in the 90s, Pune was still a very small city. And every weekend, this was like a done thing. You either went with your parents, or then there were like a couple of parents who got together and took the entire society kids out somewhere in a park or somewhere close by, like a fort or something. So there is that culture of exploration and being in nature. So I think that was something that really benefited just generally.
So, moving on towards political ecology and conservation, in the last few years, there's been a lot of criticism of the idea of forest conservation. What exactly is forest conservation, and why has this model been criticized so heavily in the recent past?
Yeah. So forest conservation actually in our country is not new. It got legalized in 72 with the Wildlife Protection Act, and essentially what this means is there are some areas of wild that we need to keep completely free from any kind of human presence. And what that means and what it does is essentially causes a lot of displacement and creates sort of these wild areas that stand alone from the rest of the landscape and don't really go with the ethos of that place as it was earlier. And the main critique of forest conservation is the human rights aspect of it, right? It stems from that you are displacing communities that are already staying there, who have been living in harmony with the animals there, with the wildlife there, with the biodiversity there for generations. And suddenly you discover that, oh, this area is extremely important to protect, forgetting that the area has been protected because there are people there who believe in a certain way of life, who have been living in a certain way of life. So let me tell you an example of the Dibang Wildlife Sanctuaries, right? This is in Arunachal, and the local tribals who live there, the Ewe machines, have spoken of the tiger as a kin, almost almost like a totem or a kin to them. And this is it's a part of their oral tradition, it's a part of their religious practices. And suddenly there are some wildlife scientists who go there and quote unquote discover tigers. And suddenly now the entire push is to create a tiger reserve there. It's good to have a tiger reserve, but do you need it in places that are already protected, where local communities are already living in harmony with these animals? And probably tourism would do much more harm there than good. So this is forest conservation, and some of the reasons why it is being questioned now is the fact that people have been conserving in ways very different from what Western science looks at conservation as, but it is still conservation. So forest conservation, what it also does is to place traditional knowledge and local knowledge at a lower level than Western notions of protection of forests or biodiversity of ecosystems. So that's the reason why conservation and forest conservation is being questioned a lot in the recent time.
So that's a nice segue to our next question. So, how can traditional ecological knowledge contribute to conservation, and what role does it have for the conservation of biodiversity across India?
Yeah, so traditional and cultural knowledge associated with ecosystems is is experiential knowledge. It is the day-to-day life of people who are living with that ecosystem, with the wild animals there. So they observe nature because they are also using nature for their benefit. So it's very important for them to observe seasons, to observe the changes in the forest, in the ecosystem around them. When certain trees are flowering, what happens with the weather, which animals will be frequently coming down into the village when there are drought years, because there is a going and coming into the ecosystems and landscapes for livelihood purposes. One understands the landscape that one is living in very, very differently if as compared to, say, a scientist who would go there and is also observing the ecosystem, but is not really living there, doesn't really, his day-to-day life is not really affected by the going ons around that landscape. So I think traditional knowledge is extremely important because it is experiential knowledge, because it is part and parcel of not just the livelihoods, but the social and cultural ethos of these places. So I think it is important to understand that there are various kinds of knowledges, and each of them has a long history, a long tradition, some of it oral, some of it written down. And it's important to understand that traditional knowledge plays a very important role in conservation. In fact, I would even say that it's so ingrained in people that we can't really say that traditional knowledge contributes to conservation as we know it in the Western world. It is conservation. Their life is conservation. How they are living is how they are protecting the landscapes for so long. And if we didn't have these people living there the way they have, these landscapes wouldn't exist. So I think traditional knowledge is conservation in a lot of ways.
So you briefly spoke about the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 and how it displaces local communities for the creation of protected areas and national parks. But won't the creation of national parks and protected areas say legally protect these habitats from, let's say, mining and other extractive industries, which
Absolutely. There are two layers to this, right? One is you absolutely need the legal protection of these areas. Whether displacing people who have been dependent on these areas is the right legal strategy to conserve these areas and to protect them, I don't think that is, in my experience, I don't think that's a very good idea, because what it ends up doing is that you are exacerbating conflict in those areas. You are also alienating people from the ecosystems that they have been living in, and they begin now to see the classification of these areas into protected areas as something of no value to them. And so you're literally putting people in direct conflict with wildlife and in some ways with the state as well, when you are kind of trying to push these kind of laws. So absolutely legal protection is required. We do understand and we do know that biodiversity loss is ongoing on such a massive scale. But we also know that it is the local people who are the first sentinels, right? They are the ones who, if there is a mining action coming up or if there are big industries coming up, the local people are the first ones to say no to it in a lot of cases. Take the example of many recent events that are going on. Tench, for example, with the entire diamond mining, was the stop because people were local people, the local Bega Adivasis were the ones who said, we don't want this. What we need is basic amenities, not a big mine coming into this area and completely destroying it. So we do need legal protection, but from what is something that we need to dig deeper. Do we need protections from local people, or do we need protection from large scale destruction as it is happening?
there are cases where resettlement happens on a voluntary basis. So when do you think it is necessary to resettle a community from a protected area or a proposed protected area?
Yeah. So it is necessary to resettle a community when they want to be resettled. There are As you said, there are a lot of examples where people have asked for resettlement because the human wildlife conflict is probably unbearable and there's too much loss of life. There are also episodes where the area is very remote and there are no facilities there. So in certain cases, people have said that we are lacking access to basic amenities and we don't want to move out. So I think that's also a provision in law where it does say voluntary relocation. But does it happen voluntarily often is something, at least from whatever research that I have done, it's usually not voluntary. Very few cases where people have said that we want to move out and they are eventually then moved out and resettled properly after being moved out.
So, what are some challenges faced by voluntary resettlement initiatives, and how can this be improved in India?
Yeah. So first of all, while the law says voluntary resettlement, from what we have studied, this resettlement is often forced, right? So there have been long histories of people asking for basic amenities like electricity, schooling, paved roads to go into the villages, and things like that, which actually do not require a lot of destruction of the ecosystem around them. In fact, we do see that a lot of when tourism enters into protected areas, there is a lot more, infrastructure that needs to come in to support tourists than it would to a small village inside a protected area. So while the WIPA does talk about voluntary relocation from tiger reserves, a lot of the times we see that there is loss of access to, maybe not loss of access, there's no access given to build a school or have electricity in the village or to ask for roads in the village. And most of the times what is stated is that, oh, because you are living inside a protected area, we cannot really give these amenities, which is completely untrue. There have been times where we have been told by forest officials that, we have deliberately cut off the supply of water or deliberately stopped a school from functioning in this area so that people will eventually get fed up and will move out. So what is voluntary also is kind of not defined. And the law is not implemented in the way that it should be, even the WNPA. In cases where there are very few cases where successful relocation has taken place, especially in the context of conservation. Most of the resettled areas that we have visited, the land titles are not clear. A lot of times, if you look at the one who judged in Rajaji and in Corbett National Park, they have actually been taken away from their traditional lifestyles. They're pastoralists. They move across. They practice transhumans. And here you're given a piece of land with no title or the title is not being given, continued delay in titling of the land. And suddenly you are supposed to stall feed your animals and then supposed to learn farming as well. So resettlement packages are also not well thought out. The other most important thing I think we all need to consider is that when people move out, the package is actually just 15 lakhs. Out of the 10 lakhs that was there 10 years ago, the amount has only been added as 15 lakhs now, which makes it even really difficult for a family to survive in that much money. So it's kind of a do or die situation for many people. And when they eventually do resettle, there are a lot of problems that follow. Social problems, political problems. Sometimes they're resettled into villages that are not welcoming of them. And obviously, you know, a village has been settled for many, many generations. There are social norms set up. And suddenly you have this whole new sort of people who come in and are staying with you. You don't know them, you don't know their language a lot of times, and you suddenly have a new set of people. Again, the village relocation also happens sometimes in places and on lands that villagers are given away by, are taken away from another village. So common lands are taken away a lot of the times. That's where probably the village has been grazing or there are other uses of that land. And then you bring in resettled people to settle them there. So there is a host of social, cultural, and economic as well as administrative problems that require a well thought of resettlement policy and package, which we do not have in our country as of now.
In 2006, the Forest Rights Act was enacted. Briefly
Yeah.
explain what this act was about and what its significance for conservation and indigenous communities is.
Yeah. So it's interesting that we've had to wait for so long because the problem with people and conservation actually starts if you look at the Indian Forest Act, right? It's a colonial piece of legislation, and it was created to take over large swaths of forest so that they could aid in empire building. So legally, you cordoned off areas rich in timber, sometimes areas which you wanted to grow trees on. So that is the bulk of the forest estate that comes into that's part of what we call forest land in India. And this is the Indian Forest Act, which very clearly categorizes forests as reserve forests, village forest, protected forest. So there is no ecological basis to this classification. Within the Indian Forest Act, there was something called as a, or there is something called as the settlement of right process. So whenever a reserve forest has to be declared in an area, a collector is appointed and he calls for people's rights over the land to be brought to him, and he will decide whether those rights should be given or should not be given. If the rights are given, that portion of land does not get notified as reserve forest. But if it is not, if it is taken away, then you don't have any rights over that piece of land. If the collector thinks that you are not eligible. So in this case, what has happened is that there has been a systematic, since colonial times, there has been a systematic sort of or othering of the people who are most dependent on these forests, right? So you have, of course, our scheduled tribes, and then you have other traditional forest dwellers that the Forest Rights Act talks about, which includes people who are not classified as scheduled tribes, but who have been living in that place for generations. So these could be pastoralist groups, these would be nomadic groups, it could be fisher folk, different categories and castes of people. What this has done, what the colonization of our forests has done is that it has rendered all of these people basically homeless and has not provided any sort of legal title to their lands. And this was causing a problem. It was causing a problem because you could easily evict them if there was any sort of conservation measure happening. You could evict them if there was any infrastructural project taking place, and you didn't have to be responsible for them. The state needs to be responsible for the last of its citizens. But if you are a persona non grata without rights or without legal rights, what it makes you is that you are not entitled to compensation. You are not entitled to any sort of ameliorative measures that the state has. So this was an ask which was being spoken about for many, many years prior to 2006 as well. And it sort of took momentum around 2002 when MOEF came up with a bunch of circulars that declared certain people as encroachers over forest land. And then there was a mass movement across the country of forest department personnel, literally physically evicting a large number of tribals. And this is well documented. And it was as a result of this mass action that the push towards having a certain kind of legal or recognizing that people need legal rights over the forests that they live in, due to which the Forest Rights Act was actually enacted in this country. So it's a piece of legislation that talks about the historical injustice that has been done on scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers through conservation and through other means, including infrastructure development and things like that. And it recognizes and vests certain rights in forest dwelling communities. Now, these rights could be a right to their land, to community forest resources around them, which includes a right to say, a right to fish in a particular water body, the right to access, to move from one village to another, the right to collect and sell forest produce, the right to their own traditional knowledge and and systems. For pastoralists, the rights to access grazing lands. So these are the kind of community rights because because people practice this in groups. And then you also have another kind of right, which is the community forest resource right, which is essentially the entire forest around you, which you have had traditional access to, gets a title in the name of the village Gram Sabha. And then another neglected sort of right, which I was also talking about before, is the right to development, is the right to have a school, is the right to have an Anganwadi center, a right to have a primary health center, right to have a small road going into your village, electricity. And that process has actually not been kept under the FRA, but it has a parallel with the Forest Conservation Act as well, where the village has to ask for the diversion of forest land from the local forest authority. So this is what the Forest Rights Act is, and the history of the enactment of the act.
So it's been 20 years since the law was enacted. So criticism of the actual legislation. How can the legislation be improved and its implementation also be improved?
Yeah. So yes, it's been 20 years, but the implementation of the act actually started around 2010. It didn't start immediately in 2006. One is that suddenly you have almost a shift in regime, right? All these years, the state is the custodian of the forest, and it's supposed to oversee whatever is happening. And suddenly, this act comes about, which is actually giving the power to the lowest decision-making body, which is the Gram Sabha, to say that, okay, this is our forest, these are our rights. Please give us the paper to prove that, give us the paper to say that these rights are ours. So there's a regime shift, and it's very difficult when the regime shifts to for the person who has to give away the power to actually accept it. So there were a lot of cases filed, in fact, against the Forest Rights Act very early on, before its implementation began. And it took a long time for the implementation to actually begin. As of now, the situation of actually handing over titles to people is quite dismal. In 2016, 17, I was part of a group called the Community Forest Rights Learning and Advocacy Process that actually surveyed the efficacy of implementation of this act. And at that time, only 2.4% of the act was actually the potential of the act to give titles over forest land was only 2%. It reached only 2% of the potential. And the progress since has also been pretty slow. If you look at today's scenario, it could be somewhere around 4% to 5%, right? And this is based on a set of factors. One is the general reluctance from the administration, from the forest administration, to let this act be implemented. The second is also that the department, which is the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, as well as the Revenue Department, the collectors, the SDM, they themselves they don't really understand what the act is about, and they do not know how to go ahead with it because the name itself says Forest Rights Act. So immediately the onus is put on the Forest Department to implement it, whereas the Forest Department does not have a role to implement this act. The third and most important part is actually the reluctance to hand over up. And I say this with a lot of responsibility, but if you look at the major movements in the country against large-scale destruction of forest, it is actually the local people and the tribals who are standing up against it on the ground. And this act is a tool because under Section 5 of this act, it actually allows Gram Sabhas to say that this is a destructive activity. We don't think that this is going to keep our forests safe, the integrity of our forests safe. And I'm actually prevent this destruction from happening. This is actually what Section 5 says. And to operationalize that, we also had a circular linking the Forest Act to the Forest Conservation Act so that there was free, prior, informed consent of Gram Sabhas to any kind of destruction that goes on in their forests. And this, I think, became a point of contention because a lot of communities actually use these provisions to say that we don't want the high-speed railway line going through our forests. We don't want this high-voltage electricity line, whether it is renewable, whether it is hydropower. We don't want this to come into our areas because it's harming us, it's harming the animals here, it's harming the ecosystem, and we also are not getting any benefit out of it. It's completely taken away somewhere else, big cities. So these are the kind of, I think, challenges that implementation of the Act faces even today on the ground.
So you have been very vocal about the impacts of the recent Forest Conservation Amendment Act. Why is this the case, and what are the key implications of the amendments?
Mhm. So Anish, if we look at the history of the Forest Conservation Act, it's a piece of legislation that came about in the late 70s. And at that time, to divert any sort of forest land for any kind of activity, the state governments under the IFA, there's a section under the IFA, Section 25, that actually allows the state governments to de-reserve that land. And what was happening because of this was there was a lot of destruction of forest land, and the central government at that time was a little worried about this. And so they decided that, that hold on, there needs to be some sort of regulation to see how much of this land are we actually giving away to infrastructural development or other kinds of development. We do need to protect some parts of our forests from big infrastructure or even an unfavorable kind of impact. Even if it's a small project, if it's having some sort of bad impact on ecosystem, we need to know how much is being diverted, why it is being diverted, whether social and environment safeguards have been taken into consideration. And so in 1980, the Forest Conservation Act actually came about to have a check system on the cutting of forests or the destruction of forests. And the act then talks about how forest clearances or clearance to the certain project that is going to take over the land needs to happen. Now, the act was very small. It had 5 sections initially, and there were the procedure was described in the rules, and there were also a lot of clarifications that had to be done through notifications and such like, as is the case with many legislation. But the interpretation was taken up by the court, and the court also came up with several orders. We know the Godavarman case where it's an ongoing mandamus, and there is still judicial sort of, you could say, judicial administration. I know it is an oxymoron, but judicial administration of what happens in the forest, right? And this was causing a bit of confusion also amongst, okay, how do these notifications come to play? Which notification is useful in this process of a lot of cases of forest violations, some of which were also not really needed. The other thing was that the Forest Conservation Act was also, it needed to change with the times, the times that we are living in. So everybody was looking at the amendment of the Forest Conservation Act with a lot of hope that, it would really address some of the pressing challenges of our time. At the same time, it would take into consideration that, we have these other laws that have come about, other laws that have changed. The Wildlife Protection Act has also undergone a lot of amendments. In the meanwhile, we had the Forest Rights Act that came about, which kind of changed the relationship and the decision-making powers a little bit on forests. So that all of those people were hoping that these factors are taken into consideration. And when the draft act actually was released, it was kind of a shocking, I think, a shock to everybody when the act came, because it has a long preamble now which talks about, India has to, in the current age, we are looking at deforestation on large scale. We are looking at so much energy transition and things like that. We have NDCs that we also have to fulfill. We have to protect our forests because they are a carbon storing source. And the preamble of the act looks brilliant, but when you actually go into the details of the act, it is shocking in the way in which the procedure actually for diversion of forest land has become so much more easier. for big infrastructure projects, for say monoculture plantations, for allowing not destructive projects to come up in certain areas without the need for clearance. Many projects have, which were there in the earlier act, which said that okay, you have to have mandatory forest clearance for these kind of projects. Those projects have also been taken out of the purview of this act. So it's a double-edged sword that this act is doing. One is to facilitate easier forest clearance, and the second is to remove those activities, a lot of the activities from the purview of the Forest Conservation Act, which kind of provided a safeguard earlier that, okay, these activities, it's a no-go. We cannot even think about giving clearance for these kind of activities. So it was the first time after many years that you could actually see people who work on human rights, people who work in wildlife conservation, people who work as a sort of segue in both the areas. Everybody came on board to say that everybody had the same opinion about the act, that this is not the act that we thought that we needed in a time of multiple climate crises and biodiversity crisis that we face. So that's the reason why a lot of us have been vocal about the act. It wouldn't be wise to say much about it because now it is a subject of litigation. But we are very keen to see how this act, how the judgment, or how the court now looks at the amended act.
So India has 300 million people who are dependent on the forest. So how do we make conservation more inclusive of the people living in and around forests? And how do we socioeconomically help them without really having an impact on our biodiversity?
Yeah. So, like I said earlier, in a lot of cases in India, even today, people's lifestyles embody conservation. So, to include them in conservation is not something that is even needed. They're already conserving. In those cases, what they require is support. The communities that we have been working with have actually voiced the kind of support that they need. So they need more wildlife students to come and help them survey their forests, for instance, to say, okay, what do we have in our jungles? How do we quantify it? How do we measure it? Because we need to know how much we have left for our future generations. So there are elements of modern conservation that these communities would be interested in having exchanges about, right? In other cases, many communities, in fact, that have received rights under the Forest Rights Act over their forests have started restoration processes inside the forest land, right? Because now you have the permission. So they've tried to understand with the help of wildlifers, with the help of ecologists, botanists, to really understand their ecosystems and to say that, okay, we need to have certain processes in place. We know that we cannot keep using the forest as we have because it is degrading in quality. So what do we do to restore it? And it's important for such communities to have financial as well as technical support when it comes to restoration. And this is crucial because we are now talking about restoration as a very, very crucial aspect of climate mitigation and adaptation, as well as biodiversity revival. And there have been several examples. We have in Maharashtra, I could tell you off the bat, I could tell you three villages. One near Tadoba in Panchgao, it's called the village. Two in Melghat, Navegao and Paivihir, which have actually which were barren initially. Large parts of their forests were barren, and they have formed youth groups, they have formed older people groups where the young people and the older people come together and talk about the kind of forests that it used to be before. And then how do we now restore this forest to a state where, it is biodiverse and it is rich. And we have actually seen evidence of camera traps and so many, nightly watch oral histories and oral testimonies about animals coming into the area. Kaivir also has its own tiger that comes and frequently visits the area. So these are the kind of, I think, technical, financial, administrative help that people who are already conserving and are thinking about conservation to go in the way actually require.
Talk about your work with pastoral communities and Adivasis in Rajasthan and Odisha.
Yeah. So the Odisha example I take first because this was something that came out of a thought process out of the organization that I was working with at that time, where we were kind of inspired by some of the Latin American movements of indigenous that were taking place, where they had articulated a worldview, right, about how they see nature. And you had concepts like Pachamama and Buendavi, living well. We have our neighbors who are talking about gross national happiness in Bhutan, and we wanted to uh, we were involved in a lot of movements of local communities, Adivasis and non-Adivasis, to protect their forests. But we were keen to understand what what is this worldview that a community holds, that it is protecting that forest or that ecosystem or that part of an ecosystem with so much passion and fervor. Is it just about economics, that this is a forest where they are getting their sustenance from, and so they are ready to go to jail or ready to even die protesting against its destruction? What is it that makes them so resilient when it comes to the protection of their forests? And this led us to the Dongria Code community. And we went to the Dongria Cones in the Niyamgiri Hills in 2014, approximately a year after they had won the case against the destruction of their forests for a bauxite mining project. And what we did with them was a series of interviews, focus group discussions on really understanding what their vision was. Why did they protect their forests? Is it just economics? Is it because it's cultural? Is it because it's your home? And a lot of interesting things actually came out of it. And there was a hint of a worldview where they look at these spaces in a very different way than we would, because it is home. It is where you have your gods are in the forest. Your ancestors are buried or cremated in that space. Every tree has a spirit. The wind has a spirit. And it's all very experiential. It's coming out of generations of living in that space and really understanding what that space has to offer, yet being respectful of its boundaries and having those cultural, religious, and spiritual associations with that space. And it was a very fascinating sort of exercise. Along the same time as this was happening, there were several attempts again by the state to kind of not just the state, but also the major infrastructural companies to keep pushing for this piece of hill for the bauxite mining. And we could also see how stressed a community is when there is constant pressure to give up their forests and their land. So that was an interesting sort of study that we had done. With the Raika pastoralists in Rajasthan, this was a continuation of the same work that we did with the Domlia Code, but it actually started with the women in the community. And because despite being a community that in 2010, they came up with a biocultural protocol, which highlighted the importance of their livelihood practice on the forests around them. They are a very resilient community. They have so many new breeds of animals that they have come up with and live very frugal lives. Their animals do graze across the forest there, but the practices of grazing are also such that, the entire sort of area is kept as it is instead of it being degraded. And when we went there, we realized that it is also a community where only men speak. We weren't understanding why the women are not visible or vocal about their relationships with the forest, their relationships with the landscape. And this led us to do a small sort of exercise and case study with the women in that area. And while we were doing this, again, there was pressure on them because a national park was going to come into the area, which meant the national park actually does not allow grazing inside its boundaries. And suddenly you see this kind of imbalance, right? Where you are looking at these people going in and out of the forest, being extremely respectful of the forest, being very mindful of which part of the forest they need to graze in. And suddenly they've been told that you will have no access to this now. And so my work actually began deeper, not just with the Raika, but with local community there to understand what they felt about forest conservation. And it continues to this day with whatever support we can give to the local community to articulate its way of conservation. So these are the two communities that I've worked with.
So, what have been some of your most prominent challenges you have faced across your conservation career, and what about your favorite memories?
So I'll my favorite memories, I'll go with that first because I always like to, I think it's as personally, it has changed me as a person, what I was before I went into this. Because I do believe that there are people in the world who embody conservation and who have a certain relationship with biodiversity and forests and other ecosystems around them, which I will never be able to have. And I respect that a lot because it comes from a lot of hard-earned experience of generations of these communities. I have also, my fondest memories are that I've ended up making friends with people in these communities, and I'm still in touch with them, and I still go. It's not just when there's a problem that that I have to go there. These are my friends, so I go there for my for marriages, for other ceremonies that are there, and it's become part of my life now. The other very fond memories that I have, I think one in particular that has always stayed with me is of an older pastoralist actually in Rajasthan who I grew very fond of. And I would go on these day grazing trips with them. So these Raika pastoralists move around in the landscape during the day, and then they come back with their sheep and goat at night. And going into the forest with him is like a revelation. Every time you go, there'll be something new that you learn about the forest, right? You will learn about some kind of a tree. You have to he'll keep showing you things on the floor of the forest, some new mushrooms somewhere that he's seen, some sort of cat that he's observed, and he knows which goes with what animal. And there was this one time where there was a bear very close to us, and I had no idea that there is a bear. And he was like, "Okay, we need to head out of this space." So the fondest memories I have are of the walks, the forest walks that I do with people, and I continue doing. So yeah, the challenges I would say is the biggest challenge is that we are still very far away from recognizing the conservation, the immense, you could say, the immense contribution as well as sacrifice that these communities have in the past done and continue to do in the name of conservation for our country. I think there is a need to rewrite the way we see conservation because every wilderness in India actually has some or the other community, local community, indigenous community that is protecting it. And we don't even know many times when we go into these spaces as tourists. What are the kind of sacrifices that people have made in order to for us to enjoy these natural spaces? And they continue making. So I think that's a big challenge for India. How do you shift the narrative from fortress conservation to a conservation ethos which is more, you could say, democratic, more transparent, and more tolerant of the different kinds of conservation that is emerging from these communities. Yeah.
So that's the final question I had for you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Anish. It was great talking to you.
If you made it till the end of this podcast, feel free to leave your thoughts on the topic and do not forget to share and subscribe. Before we end the podcast, I would like to share another list of conservation books which I highly recommend. This time it is on the topic of rewilding and ecological restoration. The first is a seminal book called Rewilding, The Radical New Science of Ecological Recovery by Glenn Blight and Paul Chipson, which covers the restoration of ecological processes and ecosystem functioning by the reintroduction of species, especially megaherbivores. A less technical and science-heavy book is Rewilding Africa, The Restoration of Wilderness on a War-Ravaged Continent, which explores conservation across various heavily militarized landscapes. And the final book is Wilder, How Rewilding is Transformating Conservation and Changing the World. This covers the rewilding of various charismatic species ranging from pumas in the US to the Arabian oryx in the Middle East and the giant tortoise. And with that, I would like to end this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. See you next Monday.